So, welcome everyone. And basically I'm going to continue pretty much where I left off. If you notice, what I'm doing is I'm trying to go through the trajectory of world spirituality, global spirituality. And a couple of things that I want to remind you and point out, that practically nothing of value in the spiritual experience of early humans has been lost. So one of the great discoveries of early prehistoric humans was the sacred divine. They discovered that there is an element in nature that is sacred, and they called that by various names, but we would recognize that as spirit, that everything is endowed with a spiritual presence. And so one of the things they discovered, spirit, they discovered the other world, and one of the great adepts at being able to transverse from this world to the other world was called a shaman. There are two forms of spiritual adepts. There are shamans who travel into the other world. They have what we call OBEs, out-of-body experiences, and which a lot of people experience in near-death experiences. OBEs have not gone away. There are several people that, when I taught Death and Afterlife, I had stories from my various students who had out-of-body experiences when they had flatlined in a hospital. I had about 4 or 5 of them that I met personally at flatline, and they had that out-of-body experience where they went through the tunnel of light. You've heard of near-death experiences, near NDEs. Early proto-humans, or early prehistoric humans discovered that, and there were some people who knew how to go through that tunnel into the other world while they were still living. And I wanted to point out, in many ways, when I started studying this stuff, I thought, you know what? Jesus is a shaman. Jesus does that. Jesus is living in 2 worlds. He's from another world, but on the same hand, he can go into the other world and bring back lost souls. And the 2 examples of that is the widow's son in Nain, who he touches. They're about ready to take him and bury him, and the Jairus' daughter, where they are legally dead. They've been declared dead. Of course, the most famous story is Lazarus in the Gospel of John. But I love the one where he says the little girl is only sleeping. And they laugh at him. They just said, that's ridiculous. Quit wasting our time. But he knows because he has those shamanic capabilities. In many ways, Jesus is the greatest shaman of all time. And so that's why many Native Americans actually, black elk and reindeer, when they read the story where they were taught the gospel, they could relate to Jesus because they were shamans themselves and they were used to that other world, and they found a familiar character in Jesus as someone who could go into the other world. There are many folk peoples still on this planet have their healers that are curanderos that are able to cure people, and they go to him. Jesus acts like a curandero in many regards. He does kind of homemade ointments that he puts on people. He has them do little activities, and very much like a curandero might have you do to cleanse some ailment in your body. So I want to say that stage was developed and went into a transformation at the agricultural revolution, took place around 10,000 BC. And then the spirit is not lost. The divine sacred is still there, but it becomes more present in the cultural climate of trying to make things grow. And that's a very important stage of human development, because when you become sedentary, and then your home becomes a very sacred place. We see that at one of the oldest archaeological sites, it's called Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, Turkey. We found that the women who probably owned the property, because they probably invented agriculture, were buried in the hearth and heart of the home, in the very living room. They would dig it up and they would be buried right there. And the men, as I pointed out, were buried outside with the dogs. But that's probably how they'd want it. You know, that's exactly like they'd want it, like because this was a transition from the hunter-gatherer period where the men still went out hunting with their dogs and brought back game, and meanwhile the women were learning to domesticate animals and raise them, and they started raising things, goats and chickens and things like that, became, you don't have to go out hunting. Yeah, well, me and the boys need to get out for a while. So that's why they buried him in the outside of the house, because they liked it out there, apparently. Go out and barbecue, honey. And you can continue to be in the backyard while throughout eternity. There is that sense of afterlife, the sense of the continuity of human existence is there. We still have, as memorials of that, graveyards. So you can go just a few miles from here. One of the most famous graveyards in the world is right there in at the Mission, San Fernando Mission. It's right across from Presidente Restaurant, and it's famous because of some of the people that are buried there. I wouldn't be surprised if Richie Valens isn't there. Do you know, Jeff, if Richie Valens?
He might be. Bob Hope is there.
Bob Hope. Yeah, I love Bob Hope because, like when he was getting close to death, his wife asked him, well, where do you want to be buried? Where do you want to be buried? And he goes, I don't know, surprise me. So she booked him in the Mission Cemetery. I hope he was surprised. Something that would be surprised because he was kind of a Protestant, really, but she was able to get him into the Mission Cemetery. The fact that we bury our dead is a very strong custom in Christianity as well. It wasn't until World War I where Catholics felt it was okay to cremate the bodies because of World War I, because of the ballistic explosions that would blow them into smithereens. You couldn't find any body parts. The Catholic Church, the magisterium, determined that God can reconstitute the atoms from God. No molecule is lost. If God numbers the hairs of your head, they said, and if he knows each of not a sparrow falls that God doesn't know, then he knows where every molecule is. So in the resurrection of the dead at the second coming, they won't be lost. God can reconstitute. You see another utilization of the cultural tools of the day. They're using contemporary modern physics to say that God's a good physicist, so he doesn't lose any molecules either. But that idea, that's a very powerful idea that pervades the world. There's probably no people that doesn't have in their indigenous roots some sense of an afterlife, some sense of even accountability, that you have to give an account for yourself, some sense of behaving in a sacred fashion as opposed to in a non-sacred fashion. So those are the heritage that came into the agricultural revolution. They add the dimension of sacrifice because the idea that sacrifice is a means by which you can ensure that your crops will be healthy and that they'll produce. There are all kinds of rituals that emerge from that. And what the agricultural revolution does, it enables the growth of society. The population can grow without having to go hunt, doing the precarious adventures of hunting and the possibility of being gored or eaten to death yourself. And so that establishes the basis. And we're not really sure how the transition went from the farming industry and learning, having a peasant subsistence to where some farmers thought that, you know what, we really own the land, therefore you're living on our land. And why? Because we have a tougher army. And that's the growth of empires is very, I think, important in the stages and development of human consciousness, because it's at the stage of empires you start to get the great temples and the idea of sacred centers. So still to this day, there are some sacred centers. Can you think of any? Know of any places that are just sacred places to go?
Islam goes to
Mecca, of course, is one of the. To this day, Jerusalem has to be the holiest city on the planet because Jews obviously see Jerusalem as holy because that's where the temple, Solomon's temple, the Wailing Wall, the one residue left of that sacred space, the temple, is very significant for Jews. It's sacred for Christians because that's where Jesus was crucified and buried and rose from the dead. And then it's very important for Islam because Jerusalem was really important to Islam until the Jews rejected Muhammad's message. And then Mecca became the most important city, but still, Jerusalem was the second most city. And when Muhammad had a vision where he was taken up into the heavens, and he had a vision, he went from the dome of the rock. That's where he stepped from the temple, the residue of the temple of Jerusalem, into the heavens where Gabriel gave him all this great revelation called the Quran. So it's still a sacred city. It's probably the holiest city on places like Benares, places along the Ganges River are sacred places. There are temples all over Los Angeles, by the way, that have become sacred spots. I asked this question. This is a trick question. Is a church a sacred place? That's a good question. My professor used to ask that. Is the church a sacred place? And people go, oh, yes, yes. No, only if you're Catholic. If you're Protestant, the church is just a meeting place. It's only sacred when we're gathered. Of course, it's sacred now because we're all here. The presence, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, there I am in their midst, Jesus says. So it only becomes sacred in Protestant churches when the congregation is present. But in the Catholic Church, it's always sacred because they have an altar. That's where the sacraments are stored in an altar. It's literally an altar. So it is a sacralized place. But that sense of sacred centers and sacred places and sacred people, that's when the priesthood develops, a large, strong priesthood. Now, it's very interesting to observe spirituality and religion developments within the empire, because quite often the emperor declares himself the descendant of God, and he is on that throne by divine right. That carries forth to this very day in England, why does this one family get to occupy the throne of England? And why? That's a good issue to ask, but partially because of that strong sense of the divine right of kings. Emperors, pharaohs had a direct connection. That's why initially those pyramids, those were built as eternal housings for the pharaohs to be able to go back and forth from the deceased earthly body into the heavenly realms. And they wanted to keep the body preserved because you sometimes wanted to visit your body. And that's why they did such a great job of mummification, because your body never loses its significance in Egypt thought. And also, interestingly enough, in Judaism and Islam and Christianity, the idea of the physical resurrection of the body becomes very important. It's a tenacious idea that probably owes back to the tombs of Pharaoh. The idea of Christianity is a huge democratization of what was only allowed for elites, because anybody can now abide with God. And you are all subjects and candidates for the resurrection of your physical bodies if you are a member of God's community. Actually, everybody gets resurrected on the day of judgment, and according to Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. But what I want to think about is the relationship of spirituality to empire. So quite often there is the official religion, but what's interesting to observe is the countercultural movements within empires. And I'm going to talk, especially in the next couple of weeks, about some of the figures that emerge as a countercultural antidote to civilization or antidote to empire. And it's hard to understand Christianity without thinking about Jesus in contradiction to the imperial kingdom of Caesar. In fact, so in the Lord's Prayer where he says, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth," is very important, because that's almost exactly what they were saying about Caesar. His kingdom has come, the kingdom of Rome, and his will must be done on earth as in Rome. And so it's very interesting when Jesus takes a standard political statement of Caesar and attributes it to God the Father. Who is the Father in in the Roman Empire, the word patri, noster patri, do you know that? That's the Latin term for our Father. Noster pater is Caesar. And so when Jesus talks about the Heavenly Father and says, call no man on earth Father, for you have one Father who is in heaven, that is an anti-imperial stance. He is against the dominant civilization culture. Now, well, it's an interesting thing to see what happens when Rome adopts Christianity as the official religion, and then it becomes the Holy Roman Catholic Church. I think Jesus would have been shocked out of his shoes. Jesus must be shocked out of his shoes if he ever looks at Rome and he sees this, like at the very heart of Rome is the Vatican that has, in the power of Jesus Christi written on the walls of it. You think, these are the guys who crucified me. Rome crucified me. How did I end up getting a church here, of all places? It's a good question to think about, but the irony of religion and empire becomes a very interesting thing. And so I want to think just today about one particular empire. One of the things that civilization and empire gives to religion is the freedom and leisure to speculate about the nature of reality. So in imperial, among the part of the thing that Greek civilization has bestowed on humanity is the philosophers, and especially the pre-Socratic philosophers who really invented theology. They were the ones who started to think about the unity of reality, and they call that unity of reality theos. So whenever you see the word theology, you're actually, when you're doing theology, you're really doing an ancient pre-Socratic Greek philosophical exercise, because they thought a great deal about the unity of reality, and they demythologized the cultural overlay of the Greek gods, like Zeus. Those are interesting metaphors for the pre-Socratic philosophers and Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. That's kind of like a cultural metaphor. So it's, yeah, you can talk about Apollos, and you can talk about Venus or Aphrodite and those gods, but they have sort of symbolic import for what we do as humans. But they are thinking about an abstract that cannot be conceived by the mind of humans. And it's interesting to find that that concept takes place around 500 BC, which is called the Axial Age by a philosopher called Jaspers. In the Axial Age, because of the civilization and a lot of religious heritages that they could draw upon, they began to start asking the really deep, fundamental questions about what is the nature of reality and what is the purpose of human existence. It's there in about 500 BC where you start to see the great prophets, Isaiah. You get Plato, Aristotle within that period. It's amazing. You get Confucius is within that period, and so is the Buddha. And where I'm going with this is a basic kind of head-to-head encounter of Buddha with the Christ. To me, the greatest competitor to Christianity, philosophically, spiritually, intellectually, and metaphysically, is Buddhism. And so I'm really going to take us there. But I just want to begin to talk a little bit about what one of the great imperial gifts to the world was yoga in India. What happened, and yoga is itself a countercultural revolt, rebellion against the imperial kind of the cultural status of civilization. You know, have you ever seen those Club Med vacation commercials? Club Med, the antidote to civilization, and it shows you some sort of pristine escape into nature. Well, that was basically, Confucius was a great product of high culture and education and technology, but it found in China a counterbalancing cultural revolution in Taoism, which said, no, we don't need cities and we don't need government and we don't need overarching education. Teachers, leave the kids alone. Let's get out to nature, and that will teach us everything we need to know, because that's where we discover the unity of reality. But only that thinking only comes about like after you've got a very cultivated civilization to begin to think about those things. And one of the great places where they began to think about those things was in ancient India. And they speculated very much about the nature of reality and the nature of the human soul and what its purpose was. And so I would argue that yoga is one of the great spiritual discoveries in terms of technique, of being able to devote yourself entirely to the absolute. And there's nothing more important than the soul's union or reunion with the absolute of God. So you may have heard this statement, Atman is Brahman. Atman means the individual self. Brahman is that single unitary principle of ultimate reality in which all the gods and all reality participates. And it's within that philosophical tradition of yoga that the Buddha emerges as exportable yoga. And it's a very interesting thing to compare. A lot of churches ban yoga. They'll have yoga in the basement and they ban it because they rightly recognize that it is a spiritual tradition. The thing that they wrongly do is they throw the baby out with the bathwater. They don't really tackle. I've yet to see the great Christian evangelical pastor who's really able to take yoga, the conceptual metaphysical framework of yoga, and the claims of the Buddha to take it seriously. Now, Hinduism has no problems with Jesus. When the missionaries come, they go, oh, and Jesus is who? Well, he's the Son of God. They go, oh, well, sons of God are, pretty, we have lots of sons of God. He goes, no, he's God incarnate. Oh, we have a handful of those guys too. We call them avatars. They are avatars who are the manifestation of God. One of the great spiritual documents of all time is the Bhagavad Gita. And it is a complete assessment of the nature of reality and the nature of human souls in culture. And there's several portions I like about it, but one of the places where in the Bhagavad Gita, he's talking to his disciple Arjuna, and he explains to him, I am the very core of reality. I am the unspoken thought at the base of the mind. I am the word at the tip of the tongue, and I am the source and foundation of all reality. All souls and all gods reside in me. Now, does that sound familiar to you? Anybody ever hear anything like that in the Bible? So when Moses is standing before the burning bush, this is one of the great revelations about the nature of God. He says to him, I am. What's your name? He goes, I am what I am. Or I will be what I will be. But it's predicated on the verb of existence. What it is, I am the existing one, the eternal existing one. And it's very interesting. In the Bhagavad Gita, that is the claim that Krishna makes when he is evoking himself as the presence of the Godhead in human form. He says, I am the foundation of all reality. And I love it too. It's very magnificent because it has no problems with other religions. Because Krishna says at some point, he goes, you know what? And there are people that worship other gods in ignorance, not knowing that I'm really the only God. But that's okay. As long as they do it with true devotion and true piety, I will still bring them to me and I will reincarnate them into a family where they can really know the truth, where the Dharma is taught. And that's a very, very profound statement. So when missionaries came to try to convert Hindus, they go, we're kind of already there. We just see Jesus as another avatar. And like missionaries go, he's not just another avatar. And they'll go, what do you mean just another avatar? How common do you think avatars are? There's only about 10. There's only about 10 avatars that we know of. And so that's not that common. And in the Bhagavad Gita, he says, I will never let things get so decayed and taken over by the demons that I do not manifest from myself someone who will teach you back to the path of righteousness. I will send forth a teacher of righteousness who will take you back to the truth, the Dharma. And so they say it's no problem recognizing Jesus as this. He is a consummate yogi. I love it, Sai Baba, one of my favorite studies. I did a study of Sai Baba. There was a Satya Sai Baba who was died about 1907 or something like that. He says, but don't worry, because he had a great following. He had following among Muslims and Hindus. And he says, but I will return. I will return shortly. And so about 15 years later, a young kid comes up and says, I am Sai Baba returned. And he certainly had a huge following. Sai Baba, he was able to do miracles. He healed people. He did magic tricks as well. He could make your watch disappear off your wrist and things like that. But Sai Baba, I saw an interview where he says, oh, Jesus, yes, we remember Jesus. Jesus came to India. That's where he came in his youth. He came there he was there from the time he was 12 till he was almost 30. He became a great yogi, walked across the Ganges. I love it. Because he walked across the Ganges, healed people. He could give sight to the blind, which is a yogi power. He could read people's minds. He could pass through walls. But at a certain point, he says, I must go back to Israel. And we told him, Jesus, don't go. They won't understand you. They will kill you. And they did. He went back. And they killed him. But so powerful a yogi, he could raise himself from the dead. And he came back and lived out the rest of his life in India. And so that actually becomes a competitive narrative to Christianity. But they have a complete metaphysical explanation for how do you get a person like Jesus, an extraordinary miracle worker, and a person of such obviously divine attributes. Well, we have that. We understand that. Let us explain to you, mere Christians. For you realize in Hinduism, we have traveled every path, and it is like being on a huge mountain trying to get to the summit. And the more you go up the summit, the more the paths come one until you finally reach the top, and there's only one path at the top. So why not join us at the summit? That's what Vivekananda said in 1898 at the American Council of Religions met in conjunction with the Chicago World's Fair. He gave and made that pronouncement, started the Vedanta Society, and it is a complete explanation of all the possible spiritual paths that you can try. But if you join us in India, you'll realize we sit at the summit, so come join us at the top. It's kind of a little bit of arrogance in that statement there. But they do have a complete explanation for Jesus. And so I will go into another really complete explanation for Jesus from another world religion next week when we look at Buddhism, because as I said, that is the greatest competitor to Jesus. But I like to think of religions as both potential rivals and potential allies. So you'll have to come back next week to get a more satisfactory conclusion, but I promise there's one coming. Anyways, we got to play some music.